müsst euch schon in jüngsten Jahren zu diesem Begriff der Ehre bekennen.
In the darkest chapter of the 20th century, one man's rise to power cast a shadow across Europe that would lead to unprecedented destruction. But Adolf Hitler did not act alone. Behind the Führer stood a circle of ambitious men, opportunists, ideologues, and calculating strategists who competed for his favor even as they implemented his vision for a 1,000-year Reich. Their personal rivalries, power struggles, and unwavering loyalty to Hitler would shape the course of history and ultimately contribute to the Third Reich's downfall. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. For many in the Reichstag, it was a shocking development, but for Hitler's closest supporters in the Nazi Party, it marked the beginning of a secretive race, a competition to determine who would become the most powerful figure in Hitler's inner circle. In these early days of the Nazi state, a select group of men positioned themselves at the center of power. Each brought different talents, ambitions, and methods to the regime's leadership. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, and a fanatically loyal member of the party. A true believer from the earliest days, Hess had been with Hitler during the failed beer hall putsch of 1923 and had even served prison time with him, where Hitler dictated parts of Mein Kampf to him. Hermann Goering, whose charm, political connections, and opportunism rewarded him with a slew of important positions. A decorated World War I flying ace, Goering brought military prestige and upper-class connections to the Nazi leadership. His extravagant lifestyle and outgoing personality made him the public face of the regime in its early years. Ring was a man of appetites, for power, for luxury, for attention. Unlike many of the Nazi leaders who came from humble backgrounds, he moved easily among the German elite. This made him invaluable to Hitler, who needed respectability to consolidate power. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, with a doctorate in literature. The club-footed Goebbels was the intellectual of Hitler's inner circle, a master of mass communication who understood how to manipulate public opinion and create the cult of personality around Hitler. Heinrich Himmler, the soft-spoken but calculating head of the SS, initially appearing unassuming, even meek, Himmler would transform himself into one of history's most methodical mass murderers. His organizational skills and attention to detail made him the perfect administrator for the Reich's most horrific policies, and Ernst Arham, head of the SA, the Sturmabteilung or Storm Detachment, a paramilitary organization staffed by violent enforcers known as the Brown Shirts. Arham had been with Hitler from the beginning, but his vision for the Nazi revolution would soon put him on a collision course with his Führer. What's fascinating about Hitler's leadership style is that he deliberately fostered competition among his subordinates. He created overlapping spheres of authority, forcing his lieutenants to vie for his favor. This prevented any one of them from becoming too powerful while ensuring Hitler remained the ultimate arbiter. By mid-1934, Hitler faced a growing crisis within his regime. The SA had swelled to a force of over 4 million men under Ernst Arham's leadership. This vast paramilitary organization threatened both the traditional German military and Hitler's vision for the Nazi Party. Arham, once one of Hitler's closest allies, had become increasingly problematic. He envisioned the SA as a revolutionary army that would absorb the regular military, a prospect that alarmed Germany's traditional military leaders. Moreover, Arham's open homosexuality and the rumored debauchery of the SA leadership provided ammunition for his enemies within the party. Arham represented the socialist aspect of National Socialism, which Hitler had increasingly abandoned to gain support from Germany's industrial and military elites. The SA's revolutionary zeal had become an obstacle to Hitler's consolidation of power. Behind the scenes, Hermann Goering and Heinrich Himmler worked to convince Hitler that Arham was planning a coup. They presented Hitler with manufactured evidence of Arham's supposed treachery, exploiting the Führer's growing paranoia. From June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, Hitler ordered a purge of the SA leadership. The operation, later known as the Night of Long Knives, was primarily carried out by the SS, once subordinates to the SA but now under Himmler's direct control. In the early hours of June 30th, Hitler personally led a contingent to arrest ROM at a resort in Bad Weisse. Across Germany, SS squads rounded up SA leaders and other political opponents. Many were executed without trial. By the time time the purge ended, dozens had been killed, not just SA leaders but also political opponents and old allies suspected of disloyalty. Among the victims was former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and his wife, shot in their home. The Night of Long Knives was a pivotal moment in Nazi Germany. It demonstrated Hitler's willingness to use extreme violence against even his oldest supporters. It also signaled the rise of the SS under Himmler as the primary instrument of Nazi terror. On July 13th, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, justifying the purge as necessary to prevent an SA coup. The German establishment, military leaders, industrialists, and the public largely accepted this explanation, relieved that the unpredictable SA had been brought to heel. For Hitler's inner circle, the purge was transformative. Himmler's SS, having proven their loyalty in eliminating the SA leadership, were rewarded with independence and expanded authority. By August 2nd, Hitler had removed all obstacles to absolute power, becoming a Führer of Germany upon President Hindenburg's death. By the mid-1930s, the structure of Hitler's inner circle had been firmly established. Each man carved out his own empire within the Third Reich, always careful to maintain loyalty to Hitler while undermining rivals. Heinrich Himmler had transformed the SS from a small protection force into one of the most powerful institutions in Nazi Germany. Their role in the Night of the Long Knives was rewarded with unprecedented authority. By the eve of war, the SS had absorbed control of all police forces, including the Gestapo, the secret state police originally established by Göring but transferred to Himmler, who appointed the ruthless Reinhard Heydrich as its head. The SS was also responsible for enforcing racial laws and, eventually, running the concentration camp system. Himmler created a state within a state. The SS had its own military units, intelligence services, and economic enterprises. It operated largely outside the normal legal system, answering only to Himmler and, through him, to Hitler. While Himmler built his security empire, Hermann Göring focused on economic power and personal enrichment. Along with his position as head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, Göring was appointed plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan in 1936, giving him control over German economic and industrial policy. Göring used his position to amass a personal fortune, collecting art, jewelry, and vast estates. His extravagant lifestyle created resentment among other party leaders, who viewed his self-indulgence with disdain. Nevertheless, his charm and efficiency kept him in Hitler's good graces. Joseph Goebbels, meanwhile, consolidated his control over all forms of German media and cultural expression. As Minister of Propaganda, he orchestrated every aspect of public communication, from newspapers and radio to film and art. His genius lay in understanding the power of modern mass media to shape public opinion. While others cultivated public personas, another player remained in the background. Martin Bormann, initially a relatively minor figure, worked diligently as Hitler's personal secretary. His unassuming demeanor masked a calculating mind, and he used his proximity to Hitler to marginalize rivals and expand his reach. Hitler deliberately encouraged competition among his lieutenants. By keeping them divided and dependent on his favor, he maintained his ultimate authority. The resulting system was chaotic but effective, at least in the short term. Each leader built his own fiefdom while competing for Hitler's approval. As Germany moved toward war, the inner circle's dynamics shifted. Military matters took precedence, and those who could deliver victories gained influence. The early territorial expansions, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the occupation of Czechoslovakia vindicated Hitler's aggressive foreign policy and strengthened his hold over both the military and his inner circle. Hermann Göring, as head of the Luftwaffe, played a central role in German rearmament. He boasted that his air force would dominate European skies, famously declaring, "If enemy bombers ever appear over Germany, you can call me Meyer." The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of World War II and a new phase in the Nazi leadership's internal dynamic. Initial military successes reinforced Hitler's belief in his own strategic genius, making him less receptive to advice, even from his inner circle. For Heinrich Himmler and the SS, the war provided opportunities to implement the most radical aspects of Nazi ideology. Special SS units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army into Poland and later the Soviet Union, carrying out mass killings of Jews, intellectuals, and other undesirables. The war allowed Himmler to vastly expand the concentration camp system and begin implementing what would later be called the Holocaust. The chaos of war provided cover for these crimes, and the need for forced labor gave an economic rationale for the camp system. Joseph Goebbels Goebbels' propaganda machine went into overdrive, celebrating German victories and preparing the population for total war. His mastery of media allowed him to maintain public morale even as the conflict expanded. In May 1941, a shocking event disrupted Hitler's inner circle. Rudolf Hess, who had been gradually sidelined in the Nazi hierarchy, made an unauthorized flight to Britain, believing he could broker a peace deal with the British to end the war in the West. Hess flew a Messerschmitt Bf-110 to Scotland, where he parachuted into captivity. Hitler was furious at what he saw as a personal and political humiliation. He publicly denounced Hess as mentally unstable, stripped him of his titles, and removed any mention of him from party propaganda. Martin Bormann was the primary beneficiary of Hess's fall. He was promoted to head of the party chancellery, significantly expanding his influence. Bormann, the quintessential behind-the-scenes operator, now controlled access to Hitler and the flow of information to the FE Führer. Hess's flight to Britain revealed the growing desperation within Nazi leadership as the war expanded. It also demonstrated how quickly someone could fall from grace in Hitler's inner circle. Bormann was particularly skilled at exploiting such opportunities. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked a critical escalation of the war. Hitler's decision to attack his former ally against the advice of many military leaders reflected his growing self-confidence and the diminishing influence of even his closest advisors. The early successes in Russia reinforced Hitler's belief in his strategic genius, but as German forces bogged down before Moscow and Leningrad, cracks began to appear in the facade of unity. Meanwhile, another figure was cementing his position as one of the most ruthless and cunning members of the Nazi regime. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office and Himmler's top deputy, oversaw the Gestapo, the intelligence service, and much of the Nazi security apparatus. Heydrich was perhaps the most dangerous man in the Third Reich. Intelligent, efficient, utterly ruthless. He was the primary architect of the Holocaust, chairing the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 that coordinated the final solution to the Jewish question. On May 27, 1942, Heydrich was attacked in Prague by Czech resistance operatives. Though initially surviving the ambush, he succumbed to his injuries a week later. Hitler ordered brutal reprisals, including the destruction of the Czech villages of Lidis and Legokai. Within the inner circle, Heydrich's death created a power vacuum. For Himmler, it meant losing his most capable lieutenant. For others, it removed a dangerous rival who had been collecting incriminating evidence against many Nazi leaders through his extensive intelligence networks. As the war progressed, military setbacks undermined the position of several members of Hitler's inner circle. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 marked a turning point, leading Hitler to become more isolated and paranoid. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's closest confidant, saw his influence wane as the Luftwaffe failed to deliver on his grandiose promises. The defeat during the Battle of Britain left the Royal Air Force as a permanent threat to the Reich's security. His leadership of the four-year plan had also faltered, and his extravagant lifestyle and frequent absences from critical military discussions diminished his standing with Hitler. By 1943, Göring had become a shadow of his former self. Addicted to painkillers, increasingly detached from reality, he retreated to his estates while continuing to amass art and wealth. Hitler began to see him as unreliable and ineffective. As Göring's star faded, others rose to prominence. Albert Speer, initially Hitler's architect, had succeeded Fritz Todt as Minister of Armaments and War Production after Todt's death in a plane crash in February 1942. Unlike many in Hitler's inner circle, Speer gained Hitler's trust through competence rather than flattery or manipulation. Under Speer's direction, German war production actually increased despite Allied bombing. His rational, technocratic approach contrasted sharply with the ideological fervor and court politics that dominated much of the Nazi leadership. By 1944, Germany's military situation had become increasingly desperate. Allied bombing devastated German cities, while Soviet forces pushed steadily westward. The D-Day landings in June opened a second front in Western Europe. On July 20, 1944, a group of Wehrmacht officers attempted to assassinate Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The plot failed, but it profoundly shook the Nazi leadership and confirmed Hitler's growing paranoia. The failed assassination led to purges within the military and heightened distrust even of Hitler's closest confidants. For the SS, it was an unexpected boon, as their grip tightened on security and military matters at the expense of the now suspect Wehrmacht. Admiral Karl D. Nitz, commander of the German Navy and uninvolved in the conspiracy, gained Hitler's favor as the Führer sought loyal replacements for suspected traitors. Donitz's military acumen and unwavering loyalty would ultimately lead to his appointment as Hitler's successor. Joseph Goebbels' role became increasingly critical as Germany's situation deteriorated. If total war speech at the Berlin Sportplatz in February 1943 had called for unwavering sacrifice from the German people. By 1944, his propaganda efforts intensified, portraying every setback as a prelude to ultimate victory. Goebbels was perhaps the only member of Hitler's inner circle who remained effective until the very end. His propaganda machine continued to function even as Germany collapsed around it. In 1944, he was appointed Reich plenipotentiary for total war, giving him extensive powers over the civilian population. Martin Bormann, meanwhile, had become Hitler's gatekeeper. As the Führer retreated from public view, Bormann controlled access to him and filtered the information he received. By 1945, Bormann had become one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich, carefully manipulating decisions in his favor and isolating Hitler from dissenting voices. As the Third Reich collapsed in early 1945, betrayal and paranoia consumed Hitler's inner circle. In a last bid for relevance, Hermann Göring sent a telegram to Hitler in the Berlin bunker, requesting permission to assume leadership, believing Hitler incapacitated. Martin Bormann framed this as treason, showing the message to Hitler in the most damaging light. In a fury, Hitler stripped Göring of all his titles and ordered his arrest. The once designated successor was now branded a traitor. Heinrich Himmler, too, fell from grace in the final days. Having secretly initiated peace negotiations with the Allies through a Swedish intermediary, Himmler's actions were discovered, leading to his ejection from all positions of authority. Hitler condemned him as the most treacherous traitor of all time. Isolated in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler trusted only Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. His paranoia had driven him to condemn most of his former allies as traitors. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the center of Berlin, Hitler committed suicide alongside his new wife Eva Braun. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda followed suit the next day after poisoning their 6 children. The fate of Martin Bormann remained a mystery for decades. Long thought to have escaped, his remains were eventually discovered near the Führer bunker in 1972, revealing that he had died while trying to flee Berlin. Hermann Göring was captured by American forces. Facing trial at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity, he committed suicide by cyanide capsule hours before his scheduled execution. Heinrich Himmler took his own life while in British custody. Albert Speer was one of the few top Nazi leaders to escape the death penalty at Nuremberg, presenting himself as a merely technical figure who had been unaware of the regime's worst crimes. He received a 20-year prison sentence. Rudolf Hess, who had remained in British captivity since 1941, was sentenced to life imprisonment and remained the sole inmate of Spandau prison until his suicide in 1987 at age 93. The collapse of Hitler's inner circle mirrored the disintegration of the Third Reich itself. A regime built on personal loyalty, ideological fervor, and ruthless competition ultimately devoured itself from within. Hitler's leadership style, setting his subordinates against each other while maintaining ultimate authority, created a system that was inherently unstable. It depended entirely on his personal charisma and ability to balance competing factions. Once his judgment began to fail, the entire structure collapsed. The members of Hitler's inner circle were not merely following orders, they were active architects of the Third Reich's policies, competing to implement Hitler's vision and often pushing it to more extreme lengths. Their personal ambitions, rivalries, and ideological fervor fueled a regime that brought unprecedented destruction to Europe and committed genocide on an industrial scale. The story of Hitler's inner circle offers a chilling lesson about the dangers of authoritarian rule, personality cults, and the corruption of power. It reminds us that history is shaped not just by grand ideologies and impersonal forces, but by the ambitions, fears, and rivalries of individuals willing to sacrifice millions for their own advancement and twisted vision of the future.